Thank you for joining us today for VDI Impact on Networks and Network Management, Challenges, Successes, and Best Practices. My name is Lee Gould, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Our featured speaker is EMA Managing Research Director, Jim Frey. Jim has 20 years of experience in the computing industry, developing, deploying, managing, and marketing software and hardware products, with the last 19 of those years spent in network management, straddling both enterprise and service provider sectors. At EMA, Jim is responsible for the network management practice area. And before I hand things over to Jim, I did want to mention to today's audience that Jim will be concluding his presentation with a Q&A session. So we encourage you to log your questions at any time throughout the course of the presentation, and Jim will address those at the conclusion of his presentation. You can log those in the Q&A panel, or else if you're in full slide view, simply look for the floating toolbar. You'll see a question mark icon. Click on that, and you can log your questions that way. Also, today's event is being recorded, and you will be receiving a follow-up email from Enterprise Management Associates later this week, and it will include the played version of today's webinar. And I did want to take a moment to thank the sponsors of this new VDI research. They are Cisco, Citrix, and ExtraHop. And now I would go ahead and turn things over to our featured speaker, Jim Frey. Jim?
Thanks, Rolly, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. I think we've got a really interesting topic, a very timely topic to go through with you today. My thanks to our sponsors as well for making it possible to do this research and share the data we're going to share with you today. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to jump right in. And let's see. It would help if I was able to. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to look at why we decided to do this research study, what drove us to go look at this, and the impact of VDI on networks. I'll give you some background on who participated in the study and who we drew the data from. We'll start by looking at the environment, the context that these folks were giving us their information in, and some interesting findings in that area that I'll definitely want to spend some time sharing with you and going through. And then we're going to look at the two kind of core groups of practice areas that I think are of most interest to networking professionals, which is what we're trying to service with this particular research. One is the planning and the optimization side of things, and then the other is the monitoring, troubleshooting, and ongoing understanding of quality. And in particular, on that latter point, the network viewpoint and the network angle on that challenge. We'll finish up with some takeaways and some recommendations, and then we'll move into the Q&A session. So first off, why did we decide to go look at this? Well, the latest interest really came from research that I published earlier this year in February. It was called Network Management Megatrends 2012, and we looked at a whole bunch of different things that were driving and influencing network management, both the technologies, the tools, the practices around them. One of the interesting findings we had when we asked what are the broad initiatives that were having an influence or an impact on network management tools, technologies, and practices, virtual and hosted desktop came back as a very, very strong impact. In fact, amongst the executives who participated in that research, 60% said this was, in their view, one of the initiatives they foresaw to be having an impact on network management. And it was only to serve virtualization in their minds at that point in time. The IT staff participants in that research had it fourth overall, so pretty high in their list, and I think there was 11 or 12 choices on that list. Not really as strong of a response. I believe they were in the high 30% range. When you have that kind of a gap between IT executive expectations and staff expectations, it means that there's something afoot. And usually what it means is there's more change coming in that area. There's a different set of expectations and realizations. The IT execs oftentimes are thinking for ahead of what's real now, which is where the minds of the networking and IT staff are. They're more concerned with exactly what's in front of them today. That's generalization I don't want it to apply to everybody because it doesn't. There are very forward-looking folks in the networking teams too, but it does sort of show a different viewpoint. And this was intriguing, and I wanted to take a look into this a little bit more. So besides that, what I've found in looking into this is that there's a bunch of interesting aspects around virtual desktop infrastructure that make it quite interesting around networking. So one, we're still early in the broad industry adoption curve. There are some organizations that have embraced it wholeheartedly. A lot of organizations looking at it, but by some of the broad market numbers, which is not something EMA tracks, but what I've found in my research, somewhere, depending on who you talk to, somewhere between 5 and 10% of the desktops in the world have either been virtualized or on plan to be virtualized, which leaves a lot of headroom, right? The key thing is that there's a lot of indications that this is going to grow pretty rapidly, and I'll show you some data from our research that backs that up. So in here, it's very cross-domain in nature. An interesting technology. It's one of the first that I've run across that requires everybody, all the different technologies that are a part of IT to work together seamlessly to pull these things off. It requires the server team. It requires the application team. It requires the storage guys. It requires the data center guys. It requires anyone who's looking at the distribution network, the wide area network if you've got remote users. It requires desktop people. Everybody gets touched by this. It impacts security as well. We'll see the impact of that when we look at some of the results we got here today. Lastly, of course, there are some technical issues specific to the network that have to do with virtual desktop infrastructure. A big element of this is VDI is highly dependent on latency and having available bandwidth for sessions to occur and be transferred back and forth between client system and server where the actual session is being hosted efficiently and effectively. And one of the big problems that's come up is certain technologies don't work real well with this sort of approach. Hairpinning means that you're adding new reversal of the network for certain functions to work. So for instance, I've given some examples here. Voice over IP, if you're trying to run a VoIP app that used to be on your desktop and now that application is part of a desktop that's been virtualized, now you have more network traversals that have to go back and forth between your system and where the virtual instance of your system is to do things like VoIP. And as we all know, VoIP and especially live video conferencing both are cases of applications that are very latency sensitive. So adding more trips back and forth between spots just eats away at the latency budget for these things. Things like USB as well, local connectivity that used to be supported directly by the application and the operating system on an end device, now under the virtual desktop realm of things, don't work the same way. So there's some interesting challenges that come up with what are traditional uses of a desktop or laptop system and one that's been virtualized, and many of them are directly going to be impacted or affected by what you do with a network. The one other thing I want to paint here very clearly is the picture of what we did and didn't do here in this particular study. There's a lot of research that's been going on around VDI, how to make it work. Most of that has been on how deployments are best optimized to take place in the data center, how you align and configure your servers, how you align and configure your storage, design and optimize both. That's not what we're looking at here. What I specifically wanted to do with this research was to say, you know what, I don't think enough of a light has been shown upon the network side of the story, meaning more so something in the data center, yes, but beyond the data center. The rest of the delivery path between where virtual desktops are being hosted and where they're being consumed by the client devices and the end users themselves. So that's the focus, networks specifically, and then associate with that the network management disciplines that have to look after as part of that. Why should you care about this? Here's a review. We're going to come back to this later and put it in context, but I want everyone to just take a quick look at one of the findings we had, which screams out to me that the networking community, the networking professionals in the organization need to be aware of this. Because looking at the folks that we did, which are those who have active deployments in production of VDI infrastructure, they asked them, who's involved in troubleshooting, availability, and performance? Well, guess what? The network guys are going to be getting bag on this one, or in the crosshairs. Like it or not, they are the most common team named as being directly involved. It's the answer in this particular question that got a majority answer. It's a broad list here, and again, we'll come back to the cross-domain nature of this, but there's a clear winner or loser depending on how you like to look at this, and that's the network guys, and network operations in particular, getting involved and stuck in this. So that's why we really want to take a close look. All right, so let's look, and I just want to share with you one more sort of setting the stage, before we set the stage with the context of the responses. A little bit of the graphics so you know who we talked to. We collected the data in late July and early August, so just a little over a month ago. 158 total respondents, very much mixed of participants, a good mix of practitioners, individual contributors, as well as quite a few executives, a mix in size of our organization as well. You can see the splits we had here, about a third each of small, medium, and large size. We did not talk to organizations that were less than 250 employees, largely because we were looking for deployments of VDI that were going to be large enough in volume that they would likely have to have engaged in some special efforts around the network. We aimed at 250 and above, so you won't see the traditional SMB type category here. We are really looking at enterprises, small, medium, and large enterprises. No particular affinity for any individual vertical in this research, and mostly North American respondents. We did have just a little under a quarter that were from European sites. We have a couple case studies as well. I'm actually not going to get to those in this discussion, but they will be part of the report that comes out when it gets published in a couple weeks. All right, I'll jump into getting some of the data results in front of you and talking about what we found. So I'll start right away with what I always get asked as the very first question, which is everybody wants to know, well, what VDI tools are being used, what solutions are being used. This is not a market share analysis here, but what it is an indication of kind of the diversity and really the dominant three brands around this kind of technology. I was a little surprised to see the strength in responses around the Microsoft solution. Certainly Microsoft Terminal Services is the old name for the kind of technology. That's really not VDI. It's not really the same thing we're talking about. But there are more recent evolved versions of this, the VDI RDSH solutions. You did quite a bit. There was an affinity for Microsoft that was greater in the smaller organizations. It was most popular in the smallest organizations that participated here. Larger organizations definitely leaned much more heavily toward VMware and Citrix. One other interesting variation, which you don't see in this view, is amongst the European respondents, Citrix was clearly the most popular of the choices. So Citrix does have a very strong position and footprint in Europe for VDI. Okay. I have a couple of views of getting an understanding of how big the deployments are. And that's a great way to understand also the sort of current state of how well VDI has been embraced, and helps us understand also the relative responses that we got later on. It'll come back up, and I'll mention this a few times as we go deeper into the data. So the two views here, how many total seats, and in this case you can see today there's an awful lot. If you look at the top two categories, between 1 and 499 seats, that's over 50% of the respondents are in that category. Lots of relatively small deployments, a lot that are in that bottom category. I mean, that could be 10, it could be 258. We didn't get that level of detail, but it's a lot of the respondents were in the top bucket. There were a few you can see down at the bottom of the graph here that were at 10,000 or more seats. What I find remarkable here is the bars in green, which is when we ask the same question of where do you expect to be in 12 months, there's a pretty dramatic shift upward of scale. Lots more deploying in the several thousand range, and a tripling of those who believe they were going to have 10,000 or more seats. Now, that's pretty dramatic growth, and that means a lot more demand for the infrastructure that's going to be supporting that growth. Another view of this is look at this by in terms of what's the percentage of seats within an organization that are being addressed using VDI. So a couple of interesting things here. Again, it's showing that there's going to be growth. There's going to be more VDI than less, quite a lot more in 12 months. The number I want to point out here is the current number today, about 51% in respondent organizations not using VDI. A lot of conversations I've had with the technology vendors, either that supply VDI or that help manage VDI, we're kind of surprised by the thought that 50% penetration was occurring within a lot of these organizations. It's interesting. I would say the better number to look at here, if you're trying to get a feel for what's the real usage rates, would be that top one. How many folks are using VDI as a primary desktop? And that's about 25%. I think that fits a lot of the other elements out there. One of the things that I added that I don't think has been asked much is has access to both as a non-VDI desktop, and then also maybe for the purposes of travel has access to VDI as well. And there's a significant number of those there. Use VDI. What we don't know is how much of the time are they using one versus the other. But it's another indication, another way to look at this. And again, the outcome of this, the takeaway from this is growth. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the models. We haven't talked much here about VDI technology itself, but essentially it involves the creation of servers that will host the sessions that you be on a laptop or desktop. And they do usually in a virtual partition on a virtual machine. So you have to have servers. Then those are attached to by end clients, very, very thin software or hardware clients. The centralized model of putting these servers in a data center is a traditional approach. That is usually how most folks look initially at deploying this. And it still is today, and that was the predominant answer when we asked this sort of deployment model question. But I wanted to attention down to the very bottom is the sort of far end of that is the distributed model, where if you have remote users who are remote relative to the central data centers, one of the ways to distribute VDI servers is to actually put them out closer to the users. This avoids the connection issues and the potential performance penalties of having those users come across a WAN link or some other link like an optimized net link to get to their VDI server. So that's becoming more and more popular. And the second bar from the top here, the hybrid model, where there's some combination of both, I think is going to emerge eventually as probably the most predominant architecture. The one that's in the middle that I haven't talked about, hosted, is the most intriguing in terms of the amount of adoption. This is a model where those VDI servers are put in an external provider, like a cloud service provider. In that model, the whole formula changes for what you care about, what you can and can't do, what you can and can't see, from a monitoring perspective, from a planning perspective, especially in terms of the network. If you don't have direct access and control over that server and where it lives and exactly what's around it, it does change the formula. That's going to be a very interesting alternative model to follow and to see how organizations are dealing with that relative lack of control. Points on this distribution here. All of the different groups of company sizes, small, medium, and large, all tended towards that central model. In particular, the medium size were the strongest strongest adopters of the centralized model. Large organizations were the least likely at this point to be using the distributed model, which actually kind of interesting because I figured they would have more need for it. Large organizations more likely having multiple remote sites. And so, very intriguingly, the large organizations were the most likely to be looking at or using the hosted model. So this is an area where I might come back and try to do more research in the future. I don't have a lot more details about the role that's going to play. It's something to put on the parking lot and come back and check on later, see how that evolves. All right, to move next to a view of the challenges that shops are facing. As mentioned, there are certain application types that some would call them VDI killers, or definitely make VDI more difficult to use as a primary computing technique for the end users. Things like voice over IP and video conferencing that require a very low latency sort of setup. I've also included the one other real killer here in the middle here is highly graphically intensive applications, and the poster child for this is CAD software, where the graphic rendering is intensive. If you no longer have a graphics card in your system, the model of VDI is actually the rendering takes place on the server, and the display bits are simply sent back across the wire. So there's a lot of effort and intensive research into alternatives about how to support these applications. But what at least for now, it's the least likely to be deployed in an integrated fashion, meaning that the VDI users have to access these applications through their virtual desktop. Much more likely that those will be the use cases that will not be put onto VDI, according to this sort of result here. Other than that, it's a kind of even mix. For the most part, you have some doing it and some not. In my own conversations with practitioners, live video conferencing has been called out on several cases as one of the most problematic cases where using a USB connected web, for instance, performance has not been good. It's been problematic, and in a lot of cases has resulted in alternative types of approaches, like set up a whole separate system just for the video conferencing. So sort of you lose the value of VI and some of the cost leverage when you start to do those things. But at times that's what's required to get there. A lot in the product design area to try to deal with some of those issues today. But this is the kind of state of where things are. Okay, now we're going to look at one of our first organizational measures, which is a quick view into who is involved in supporting, deploying. We'll look at planning, we'll look at monitoring. This is the first one. We asked, who is the overall primary responsibility for VDI operational success? And the first thing you see here is, of course, those who have VDI teams name their VDI team, and that certainly makes sense. Now, a word about this, not all organizations that we surveyed have VDI teams. Many of them are supporting VDI via the existing an organization. My assessment of this, and I don't have an exact number, but my estimations are that based on the responses, the large organizations we surveyed, about almost 60% of them had a VDI team. And that's expected. They're the big organizations. Medium-sized organizations had about 40% of them had these or indications of a VDI team in place. Small organizations still had them to a lesser extent, though. Only about 16% of the small organizations answered questions in a way that would indicate they have these teams in place. So if you kind of roll that up across them all, it's about 38%. You have to think about that when we look at these organizational questions. In some cases, you have to realize that not everybody has a VDI team. So you also look at the other choices. Because if the VDI team's in place, well, for a question like this, you're probably going to select it. But even if 38% roughly of organizations in this study had them, only 23% said they were primarily responsible for operational success. The rest of that is being handed off to the other traditional operations teams. Operations, which, by the way, is a very strong response in the European marketplace. Network operations and data center operations, they're standing next in line to pick that up and have responsibility. Next, if the VDI team, they're usually going to be held primarily responsible, and that seems a logical outcome. Next, I want to take a look at one of the best practices measures that we tried to put into. I tried to build a couple of best practices measures, and we're going to talk a lot about this in two specific practices section. So the first one is this, which was trying to assess what rate of success VDI deployments are having. One measure of that is how smooth is it in operations? How many help desk calls do you receive regarding performance issues or issues of one kind or another? The initial story here looks pretty good. It looks like most folks are only getting, a few calls a week or less. Really a strong majority answered in those two categories, which is, maybe every other day or every third day, or even less than that. That's pretty full. It sounds good. You have a few that get up to more than once an hour, but realize, those are the large organizations, and the large organizations, of course, have a lot more virtual desktops. So by the sheer law of numbers, they're going to get higher rates of calls. So there's a little bit of bias that pushes the large organizations' answers towards the bottom of this. The thing I found most interesting initially was to look at the fact that there seemed to be large organizations, 30% of them, that were getting less than one call per week. And that sounded great. I thought, oh, wonderful. Let's see what those folks are doing and see what they're doing right or doing differently from others. And what I found in looking in the data was that's the group of large organizations that still has a very small pilot deployment. I think over 2/3 of that orange bar that's less than one time per week had deployments of less than 250 desktops. So it's much more likely that they're low, and this may be the case across all of these, they're low because they don't have a big deployment yet. And as you get a bigger deployment, you'll start to see them fall into the more frequent categories. So this is something that unfortunately I don't think has evolved to a point where we can use it for a best practices in education, just because it's too early in the broad adoption in the marketplace of the technology. What we did end up having a little bit more luck with was looking at and asking, just in general, how satisfied were the participants here with their deployment of their VDI implementation. And we got a range here. And generally speaking, people are satisfied or extremely satisfied. So for the most part, everyone's having a pretty good experience with this. As you see, I split the results here to show you how executives versus staff responded. And of course, executives, they're more optimistic. Staff is more realistic, and that's always been my finding, by the way. I might say this: the executives are relatively less knowledgeable about the details of how this is working or not, and so oftentimes the staff is aware of issues that the execs are not, and that could contribute to this shift between the two. But it's interesting; it sort of parallels that early study, which said that there was a higher opinion of impact and I would assume potentially importance of a technology like VDI, versus staff who said, yeah, it's there and it's important, but it's not everything we're dealing with. Now, one other point to point out here, there were exactly out of 158 were people who said they were not completely satisfied. The number, by the way, lower left, 125, we did not ask this particular question of the people who were still in the planning mode. This covered people who deployed or were going to be deploying within 6 to 12 months. That last group was a small group. Only 33 of the overall had deployed yet, and so of course they didn't get asked this question of what their satisfaction rate was. But that little bar in the not completely satisfied is not big enough to draw any real conclusions on, with one exception I'm going to point out for you in a little bit here. So real quickly, if you look at these, if you added these numbers up or told them, we found that roughly 44% were satisfied, 37% overall were very satisfied, and 15% overall were extremely satisfied. Oh, one other point on the extremely satisfied group here, it actually wasn't just small deployments and small organizations. It was a pretty good mix. With that bar there, that 19% bar, there were 9 small shops, 4 medium, and 6 large. And in fact, one of the large ones had over 10,000 desktops deployed, VDI desktops deployed. So there were big clusters around the 250 to 500 range and the 1,000 to 2,500 range. So there are, what I want everyone to take away is, there are definitely examples of large-scale deployments of VDI where people are extremely satisfied and things are going extremely well. So we're going to look at that in a few cases, these top 2 bars versus the middle and lower bar, and then see if we can draw some conclusions about how things are being done differently. Hey, with that, I'm going to move into the first practice area. And the first practice area is optimizing the network for VDI success. So we're going to start with an organizational view, and this sort of underpins the cross-domain nature we talked about before. Groups are involved in planning VDI? Well, the answer is many. Many are involved. Slight edge towards network operations and desktop and network engineering, but other than network operations sort of out there by itself at 50%, everyone else is almost essentially tied for second. This is good. You do have to have everybody involved. A lot of people don't understand the importance, especially if you're networking pros on the line here, of application support being involved. But the reason for that is not all applications do well in a VDI deployment scenario. So you actually do have to work through and understand which applications are going to be affected, which applications are in use, whether and assess whether or not and test whether or not they will perform and respond adequately in a VDI type deployment. Let's see. Let's move up to so the next thing here is I wanted to find out what types of optimizations have been deployed on the network side. I look at this as part of a planning and optimization aspect of the network and of the infrastructure. And what we found here, I wanted to find out, are these optimizations being deployed because of the VDI deployment in order specifically to protect it, or were they planned already? Were they're already out there already? And in the broad case, you can see that for the most part, most of these technologies, they're all being used. WAN optimization, ADC and load balancer, optimized internet access, QoS definitions in the network, and data center network optimizations are all being used. In most cases, by most of the respondents, they had already been deployed or were being employed on a basis and not just because of VDI. But in general case here, pretty much across the board, at least a quarter of the respondents said, verily, we did this because of VDI. So VDI was moving and motivating organizations to make these changes. Now, the interesting variations we found when we looked at that group of extremely satisfied folks, it really flipped here. And instead of in the average case, these technologies having been deployed not specifically VDI, now they all were deployed because of VDI. And a couple of them really pop out. The network QoS class definitions and policies being deployed because of VDI. That's an incredibly strong response and change in difference. ADC load balancers as well, going from 16% to 47%. Big gap, big difference. Still a high degree of importance placed on essentially all of these techniques. But a couple of those in terms of the deltas are really quite astounding. Another aspect of this and optimizing is when you do apply network service QoS definitions, what bucket do you put VDI traffic in? There are some design recommendations out there that I've read that say you really should actually be prioritizing VDI higher than VoIP, because VoIP actually is a little bit more tolerant of latency than VDI traffic is. And sure enough, some organizations have been following that recommendation in the LAN and the WAN here. A lot of folks are just placing it in the same bucket, high priority bucket as voice over IP. Of course, this depends on how many buckets you have available. Another thing I found interesting was that there were some folks that weren't doing any prioritization, even in the WAN, for VDI. That seems hopeful, I guess would be the way I would put that, because the potential for VDI to be adversely impacted and not prioritized is immense when you get to a WAN setting. If someone decides to run a big file transfer or a backup across the WAN link and you haven't prioritized VDI over it, the VDI will almost definitely suffer, unless you have limitless bandwidth, which very few organizations do. It's a lot. There's no doubt about that. Okay, let's keep moving now. These next two measures, I'm still stunned by the responses we got on these next two measures. I went to ask, well, okay, so have you figured out, or have you tried to define, for planning purposes, what you expect the total latency, the acceptable total latency to be for VDI sessions, so that your users are having an adequate experience with VDI? Stunningly, only a third of organizations said they had done this. And in fact, even less had actually come up with some means for defining the minimum bandwidth they're going to allow per user. In a complete LAN campus setting, this might not be as big of an issue, but if you've got any remote users and you're not aware of the bandwidth demand that they're going to generate by running VDI, that's definitely flying blind. So I think the next view of the site is really interesting. We looked back at that best practices indicator. Satisfied was everyone with the result. And if you look at those in terms of which folks have satisfied, they are much, much more likely to have gone through the effort to define a latency objective. Far more effective. And here's the one place I'm going to point out, that little group of not completely satisfied. Guess where they fell? None of them had looked at this, and I just have to wonder if that was a contributor to their unhappiness. The result is less dramatic over on the side of bandwidth allowance. But still, even here, that really happy group, those very happy people, are much more likely to have at least done some more specific planning around bandwidth allowance. I'm really surprised by this again because it's still, even in that case, it's less than 50%. I think that's gonna have to change as time goes by, and especially as we see larger, more extensive deployments of VDI in bigger numbers, because the chunks that you can do up, VDI in some cases can take as little as 50 kbps. It can also take, and I've heard of plenty of cases where the allocations are around the order of a megabit, and that doesn't scale very, very well over large numbers of users. Something definitely to keep an eye on, and we'll have some practices recommendations to make about that. Okay, so monitoring and troubleshooting VDI quality. This is the other major practice area, and I want to show you a little bit more. First off, on those organizational responsibility measures. Here's that chart I previewed for you, which is who everybody that's involved. Yep, network operations is standing out there front and center, and is going to be taking a lot of the action here when there's problems that occur in availability and performance. If we do that slightly, and I asked who has primary responsibility, we see network operations come out on top, even above the VDI teams, which to me was quite interesting, and again quite telling that the networking organization has a really strong and essential role to play here, and in more often than not is right in the middle of things. It needs to be prepared. It needs to be aware of the VDI traffic. It needs to be prepared for how to both monitor and troubleshoot. Okay, so let's move to some metrics. We talked about some metrics that were being used. What were folks using to assess VDI experience and quality during the monitoring and production process? And here's a good mix of things. You'll notice some, for those who are very networking focused on the call, you'll notice latency, packet loss, jitter. These are traditional types of measures that you would do from a network perspective. In fact, they're very much the same kind of measures you would use to understand the health of the infrastructure we're delivering, things like voice over IP. But others that are in the mix here: application load time, login time, keystroke response, render. These are traditional network side metrics. These are metrics you're going to have to draw from the VDI server, from VDI server APIs, for instance, to understand what's happening, or from actually end device monitoring would be a place to find some of these as well. So this is a mix. This is a more holistic set of metrics that would be used for monitoring most other types of applications. As you can see, the top three there are pretty strong in terms of there being common techniques: application load time, latency, and login time. Definitely worth keeping an eye on those and figuring out where you can draw those metrics from in order to be on top of quality. One of the other related issues around monitoring comes down to the techniques being used and the tools being used for monitoring and how they are deployed relative to the other management tools. As mentioned before, and I'm very, very firmly convinced that VDI, to be successful, has to be treated in this sort of holistic, systemic approach because of the fact that there's so many technologies that have to come together for it to work successfully and properly in the long run. So when we asked about how, at this point in time at least, how operations were dealing with VDI, you can still see here the predominant approach is what would be called loosely coupled. In other words, there's mostly separate tools, but there are, an aggregation of events, for instance, so that there can be some sort of availability or fault or event level correlation going on to understand relationships between the contributing domains. Quite a few said they were moving into this sort of tidally coupled realm where they're really trying to tie this in at the data level, and a few souls are really trying to embrace this in a integrated fashion by embedding it right into their existing tools, so that all of the data is brought in, the events, the navigation, the menus. It's really being managed as a systemic whole. Now, this was a broad set of answers, and one of the things I thought was really interesting here when we took a look at this based on the level of satisfaction, there's some real differences in the answers here. There's size, but there's some real differences. And in fact, I think the best way to look at this is if you look at this from a sort of center of gravity for each of these groups, which sort of answers that they have. And if you look first at the satisfied group, sort of up mostly between separate, standalone, and loosely coupled. That's their strategy pretty much. And it got more satisfied. The very satisfied group they answered more somewhere between loosely and tightly coupled. A little bit more to loosely than tightly, I suppose, if you look for a true center and average here. But the most satisfied, the extremely satisfied group, clearly has spent a lot more effort trying to achieve these truly integrated management strategies. I think that's a very strong indicator of a difference between success rates, satisfaction rates, and the way that operations monitoring is being executed. Hopefully we can learn from directly. Now, a sort of a supporting element of this, figuring out where you're going to draw those metrics we talked about, and how you're going to fit them into your management tools architecture, has to do with what sources of data are available for gathering these indicators of VDI user experience and VDI quality. Now, many, you can get some from the network, you can get some, as you can see here, from direct client monitoring, you can get some from server APIs, and they all have valuable and relevant metrics to contribute to the sort of operations monitoring challenge. The most part, it shows also the fact that you're going to have to look at a mix of data sources that aren't going to come from any one traditional area. It crosses the traditional technology silo boundaries. The thing here, when I did look at the extremely satisfied shops, they focused much more heavily on the network in the data center as a place to gather that information. They also were a little stronger on direct client monitoring and a little weaker on VDI server APIs. Anything that's behind that, it's another thing that I'm going to look into more to figure out if there's rationale behind it. I don't have any good interpretations for you on that, other than it does seem that the most satisfied seem to find greater value in the data center network viewpoints. I'm just about done here, but before we get done, I have to take the opportunity to throw in front of you one true eye chart here, which is bound to make everyone's eyes swim a little bit, and I apologize for that. But there's some really interesting data that we found when asking about, mostly from the network perspective, but in general, when there was a VDI performance or connectivity issue, what were the common root causes that ended up being found after investigation? And I split this up, and I wanted to know what the case was for LAN-based users, WAN-based users, and Internet-based users, because all of these three have different network aspects to them. One is, without them all, LAN users are local, WAN is some remote dedicated private network, and Internet means you've got some means for people to use VDI desktops, but they're going to come in and using a VPN or some sort of Internet-based access technique. So found here, what I think is interesting on this, and it's kind of hard to see this, so I'll give you the top 5. Number 1, actually, no problems observed, and that's that bottom category. So what I didn't dig into is to find out are those just the small deployments, or is it, there are quite a few folks that I talked to that have said, no, we don't really have many issues. And great. It's still on average about a quarter of folks who have had a perfect experience. Number 2 actually is network traffic congestion up above. And I expected this to mostly be the case in the WAN, but you can see actually that got pretty strong responses on the LAN side and on the Internet user side as well. So congestion across the board is a fairly significant issue that folks run across. Rarely as much as not having any problems at all. Operator error comes in number 3, and that always comes up strong because in reality, a lot of end users do things that you don't expect them to do, and it causes havoc. So it is a common root cause. It came in at number 3. Number 4 is actually the third from the top. It's network latency. So between congestion and latency, those are the 2 items that the networking teams commonly have the most concern over and have the most potential control over, depending on what the real source of that issue is and the character of the issue. Number 5, and they start to get very close in number, but I will call it the 5th one, is VDI server latency. And so the first server-side root cause that we see coming out in this analysis as being a root cause. Many others pop in there. Storage comes in pretty close to this. VDI server health, end of configuration, they all start to get pretty statistically dead heat after this. And so I think the takeaway here is there's no one category that's really unlikely to happen. They're popping up. If there's 2 that are least likely to happen here, it would be the QoS policy adherence violations and aggregate load on VDI resources. It's more the network. It's more to do with latency from the server. Those are the areas that are going to be the hot spots to look at. I hope that was helpful. It is a bit confusing of a chart. And actually, I want to wrap up and leave some time for questions. So let me first give you a couple of takeaways. I hope you've been able to hear the rationale behind these points as we went along. First of all, VDI deployments, we have some pretty strong indicators that they are going to grow, and they're going to grow rapidly. There is going to be lots more of this rather than less in the days, months, and years ahead. That really does play, from what we can see, a pretty significant role in VDI success, especially when you look at the various different optimization techniques that are being used and how commonly they're being used. Network operations is on the hot seat when it comes to supporting and assuring performance and quality for VDI. Get used to it, get over it, don't complain, it's the way it is, and I'd say, better prepared than not. And a few other specific best practices to indicate based on the best practice indicators we talked about on the way through here. Number 1, network side optimizations are very, very valuable, especially, and saw the dramatic results here, focusing on putting network QoS definitions in place if you don't have them already, as well as deploying technologies like application delivery controllers. Others as well, optimized internet services, very helpful, as well as WAN optimization. They all contribute to success. These 2 are the most dramatically associated with satisfaction. Paying attention, I think this is really important. Don't forget to pay attention to the LAN. I had the same point of recommendation based on research done around voice over IP deployments, as well as research done around live video conferencing deployments. The fact of the matter is this: when you look at problems that occur with these technologies, these latency-sensitive technologies, and you look at the root causes behind those problems, as often as not, it's the LAN where the problems are occurring, not just what you would traditionally assume would be, latency and bandwidth-sensitive areas like WAN and Internet. So keep an eye on the LAN as well. Don't forget that you have to take care of that. Third, an indication is that it does seem to be helpful to go through the process and come to some expectations and agreement on what targets should be used for latency as well as bandwidth usage in the planning process. They do seem, when they're taken, to result in some better success rates. And finally, monitoring performance and quality. Those who are having better success are doing this in a more increasingly integrated manner. This is back to the cross-domain nature of the technology, of the solution, and the fact that you can't do it from just a separate group of independent viewpoints. You really need to have an integrated strategy for management monitoring to be truly successful. So for that, I would like to hand it back over to Raleigh to open up Q&A.
Great, thank you, Jim. Before I jump into the questions, I did want to point everyone's attention to Jim's network management blog. I do encourage you to check that out. As I mentioned at the start of the hour, if you have questions for Jim, you should see a Q&A panel in the right-hand column of your screen. You can log them there, or if you're in full slide view, look for the floating toolbar. You'll see a question mark icon. Click on that, and you can log your questions there. So go ahead and jump to the questions, Jim. The first one is, what are you hearing from recommended amounts of bandwidth per VDI desktop? I have heard anywhere from 300 to 400K per user. Is that accurate?
Actually, that's certainly not unrealistic. Some most optimized protocols out there, the vendors are saying you can get it down to as thin as 50 kbps. I think that's pretty optimistic, and that's only going to be effective in cases where you've got pretty straightforward, simple applications being used. There are a lot of those cases out there. When we asked that in conjunction with the question about bit use, we also asked, well, what is the bandwidth that you're? Yes, we asked what is the bandwidth, and the numbers were kind of all over the place. But the sort of median response was around that number. It was 250, 300, around that range. So that is not unusual at all.
The next question that came in is, does VDI add a delay on the network performance? Can it be measured?
That's a good question. So VDI itself does not add a network delay, but the network delay, the network response time, the network element to the factor there in the total latency. So total latency is basically when I, as a VDI user, I press a key, how long does it take for me to see that character pop up on my screen? What has to happen is it has to go from my desktop across to the server, be rendered, and the rendering gets sent back. Things happen between here and there. There's a network to traverse, maybe more than one. It might be a WAN. It might be an internet link. So the network variable is really important to understand. It varies by deployment type. Are you a LAN connected user to your VDI server? Are you WAN connected? Are you internet connected? Is that network connection pretty clean? Is there a lot of other stuff on it? Is it congested? So those are kind of things, by the way, that the networking team often has the best view of, which is health and responsiveness of the network links. The VDI folks, the people who are running the VDI server on the other end, and by the way, in the data center, there are multiple servers that work together in conjunction to deliver VDI. There's a primary login server that you're going to come to, and that's what most of the responsiveness is often measured to. But there are actual latency factors amongst the interworking servers, so that's a big variable too. But the network latency is a non-zero and a very important aspect of total latency to the end user that you need to understand. So VDI doesn't create network latency. It can suffer from network latency, and that's why you need to understand it.
Great, Jim. The next question is, in a VDI environment, is it better to have a print plot server in the data center or in the remote offices where the printer's plotters are?
That's an excellent question. This is one of those hairpinning issues where you used to be able to send your print job from your desktop, non-VDI desktop, directly to the printer. The one right to you even, and it went from where you were to the printer. Great, lovely. So the problem now is that the application that's generating the instructions for the printer is somewhere else. It's in a data center. When you press print, it's going to send that print job to, it could send it to a network printer. Sure, if it's a network printer, great. You'll have to traverse another network link to get there. Now, most organizations have already figured out and are using network printing, and so it's not terribly different from what you used to have before, unless there's a really long link and network traversal penalty involved. If it's a really huge type of print job, like a plotter, if you're doing a very intensive print job, and what you used to be able to generate and send locally now has to go traverse a WAN link, that definitely slow down the print. And you have to have, a print server usually that's going to queue up and run these things. A lot of them are built into the printer these days. The answer is, unfortunately, it depends. It depends on what kind of print jobs you have to do. You could save some of that performance penalty by having the printers or plotters in the data center, but that might not be practical. If you're working in Wichita and your data center is in Chicago, what does that do you, right? If you are in a local campus network, it might be just as easy to route that print traffic back out the campus LAN out to a relatively nearby printer as it is to do it in the data center. Depends. But this is a great example of why you need to look at all of the ways that your users interact with the system and the networked resources that are there and figure out, does it still work when I put them on a VDI sort of setting?
Let's go back to the data you looked at when you for this search. This individual wants to know, is VDI deployment growing faster in SMB or large enterprise space?
Good question. Honestly, I haven't tried to characterize that. I haven't looked at it by organization size in terms of the relative growth rates. It was appreciable in all of the categories. I haven't done a comparison. I'll have to take a look at that. Take a look at it and try to pop it out in a blog or a tweet.
Okay, great. Another question is, in a centralized VDI model with a replicated DR site, are companies doing live, or are most living with a few minutes of delay between the primary data center and the DR site?
That's an excellent question. I don't have an answer for that either, because that's sort of back on the back end design side, and that's not something that we looked at in this study. There was only so much we could do in this study. So DR strategy is a very important aspect of VDI deployments. You've got to figure out how do you back up and how do you provide alternative hosting. There's a lot of great research out about the best way to do that design, and then I have to point you towards some of the other folks out there who may have answered that question more succinctly than I can.
Good, thanks, Jim. Let's talk about storage networks. Did you find any best practices for optimizing or monitoring those?
Well, storage definitely is a big factor. You saw it was one of the confirmed root causes of issues. We didn't go into details about what was going on with storage network optimization. It got called out as an optimization technique that was being used regularly. It got called out storage as a root cause of performance issues. Definitely a piece of this mixed multi-cross-domain situation you're dealing with in VDI. We did ask one other question I didn't put up here for everybody, but it was just basically asking if any specific adaptations were made in the data center to support VDI. And pretty strong responses around having deployed dedicated network storage, either in a SAN or a NAS footprint, or actually deploying more local direct attached storage to the primary VDI server. Quite a bit of a lot of shops are trying to employ state flash type storage as well. I think we're sort of early in the adoption curve, but that's pretty promising. I believe when I looked at this from a standpoint of who was most satisfied versus less satisfied, they were leaning more towards flash-based storage on board the primary server as one technique, and then deploying SAN and NAS as opposed to direct attached storage. So those two seem to be more beneficial. I don't have enough data or background in that area to make conclusive recommendations in that regard, but it's definitely a piece of the bigger puzzle.
Great. Let's take one more question. How big an impact does end user device type have?
That's an interesting question. Certainly part of VDI, at least if you listen to the hype in the media, BYE is one of the driving factors for embracing VDI. Bring your own device, where you don't know what the end device is. You want anyone to bring their own device. Of course, the big concerns there are going to have a platform that's going to work effectively when you don't really understand what platform it is or have direct control over everything installed on that platform. And then the concern is data security. Do you want the corporate data actually residing on that device? And VDI is a way to get past both those issues by saying, nope, thin client so you can get to your resources, no data stays there, but we provide the same kind of capabilities. And this does mean that it's easier to use VDI in association with all different types of endpoints. What we didn't find yet, frankly, was a really strong validation of that yet, but that's also because BYOD is a concept and as a policy is still early. When we asked what types of devices were being used to access VDI, we had like 80+% said desktops and laptops, and that's the most common model. But we had 50% who said corporate-owned mobile devices, which is pretty surprising. So a lot of mobile devices are corporate-owned. About 35% said thin clients. So these are ultra lightweight WISE terminals. I talked to one organization that was using those specifically. So they are out there too, still in a minority. And then only about 30% said user-owned mobile devices. And this would be tablets and smartphones. This would be the BYOD crowd. And they're relatively small. So the question of impact to performance of VDI is a complex one, because if it's a BYOD sort of situation in a completely unmanaged, unknown endpoint, and you're just providing client access, well then whatever happens on that client can definitely have an impact on the perceived performance of VDI. This is why understanding what's happening on the infrastructure perspective is really important, because a call comes in and an end user says, my VDI session's crawling, it's horrible. You know, is that because something's amiss in the core infrastructure that's supporting VDI? Is the storage healthy? Is the servers healthy? Or is the network healthy? Is the rest, everybody else around that person having an adequate experience? Or is it their end device that's that's some background application that's chewing up all of its local CPU capability and allowing the VDI session to execute properly in a local sense? Still have to understand that there could be variations in any of these models. The one exception might be thin clients. Thin clients don't really have anything else to do. But all the others may have things running locally that could absolutely interfere with success of VDI session quality. So understanding how everything else is doing is important to understanding, is it a local device issue or is it a broader issue?
For taking those questions, and I wanted to thank our audience for joining us today. You will be receiving an email from Enterprise Management Associates later this week with the URL for joining us, and have a nice day.